Imagine turning on your clunky 1980s computer only to find a message from someone who claims to be living in the 1500s. And it's not just once, it's an ongoing conversation. And just when things couldn't get weirder, something else starts writing to you, something from the year 2109. And they are watching and waiting. And clearly, they're not human. This is the case of the Dodleston Messages. Part haunting, part time slip, and part digital séance. And to this day, no one has explained it. Welcome to Supernatural Signals, where the screen meets the spirits. Let's begin by introducing the main character of this story. Ken Webster wasn't a paranormal investigator or sci-fi writer. He was a school teacher in his 30s, just living a quiet life in the village of Dodleston, Cheshire. In the mid-1980s, he moved into an old cottage with his girlfriend Debbie. Their friend Nick was also staying with them for a while, so there were 3 people in the house when all this began. The place had that old British charm, stone walls, timber beams, but it also had a strange energy. At first, it was subtle, such as cold spots or small noises, things just feeling strange. But no one really thought much of it. Then came something they couldn't ignore. On Ken's BBC microcomputer, a primitive machine even by 1980 standards, a strange message appeared. And no one typed it, and no one saved it. It just showed up. The language was bizarre, old, medieval sounding. The writer claimed to be from the year 1541, and he was completely baffled by the box of lights Ken was using. Even stranger, he seemed to think Ken and his friends were the ghost. This kicked off a bizarre and unsettling back and forth between centuries, between Ken and a man from the past calling himself Lucas, and eventually something else entirely. So before we go into more details of the messages, let's dive into the details of the strange phenomenon before the messages began. So, before the computer ever lit up with unexplained messages, the house itself began to change. Subtly at first, like a slow shift into the air that no one could quite name. Certain rooms would become unnaturally cold, even when the rest of the house was warm. You'd step through a doorway and feel an invisible shiver crawl across your skin, like someone had just walked through you. At night, the stillness wasn't peaceful. It was too still. A kind of silence that hummed with tension, like the house was holding its breath. Then came the sounds. Footsteps on the floorboards that should have been empty. Soft, deliberate knocks, always just out of sight. The tapping of fingers on the wall. Or the wooden desk where the computer sat. Like someone was trying to get attention without being seen. But it gets stranger. Then came the footsteps. In the final dust that collected on the floors during the renovations, they began to find bare prints with 6 toes. Some small like a child's, others too large to match anyone in the house. They'd appear overnight, fresh and clear, only to vanish the next day. Chalk markings also began to show up on the walls. Crude symbols, lines arranged like primitive writing. No one admitted to drawing them, and no one could explain how they got there. The entire cottage seemed to take a quiet pressure, like the walls were listening or waiting. And then, as if answering the tension building in the house, the computer began to respond. Strange files appeared seemingly on their own, and within them, messages written in archaic English, letters that spoke from another time, from a man who claimed he was living in the 16th century, and he believed Ken was the intruder. So, who was Lucas, the man from 1541? The first message was short. It appeared as a simple text file on the BBC Micro. With no internet and no saved drafts, it was just there. The language was strange, old, clunky, and filled with words that hadn't been used in centuries. Now, at first, Ken thought it was some sort of prank. But after some investigating, he found that the grammar and phrasing and word choices were too specific and too authentic. The author of the message identified himself as Lucas Wainwright, though later he would say his true name was Thomas Harden. He claimed to be living in 1541, during the reign of King Henry VIII, and said he had been seeing strange lights and hearing odd noises in what he believed to be his home, the very same cottage Ken and his friends were living in. But here's the twist. Lucas, or Thomas, thought he was the one being haunted. He believed that Ken and his housemates were ghosts or spirits intruding into his world. He described hearing voices from beyond, lights glowing from a magical box, and furniture that didn't belong to him suddenly appearing. In a strange reversal, both sides thought they were the victims of a haunting. Reminds me very similar to the movie The Others. Over time, the messages became more detailed. Ken began to write back using the same computer, and somehow Lucas responded. They began an ongoing exchange, with Lucas asking questions about the strange device Ken used, and even describing what he saw on his end. He seemed to be seeing Ken's world superimposed over his own, sometimes claiming to see other people walking through rooms, hearing them talk. And just like Ken was puzzled by the Middle English, Lucas was disturbed by Ken's modern speech, clothes, and especially the glowing screen. He feared it was demonic. But eventually, Lucas said he came to trust Ken. He began sharing more about his life, his background, the time period he lived in, and his belief that something far stranger than a simple haunting was at play. Before we continue on, I want to go in a little bit more depth about the messages. Because the messages from Lucas weren't just strange. They were poetic, awkward, and eerily sincere. The language felt ancient but also deeply human, like someone trying their best to reach across time. Here's one of the first things he wrote. "What strange words thou speak, although I must confess that I hath also been ill-schooled. Thou art a goodly man, who hath fanciful woman, who dwell in thy earth. I have no want to affray, for only sith I gather thy meaning. Do I understand that thou cometh from a place that hath many things, of which I have no knowledge?" Lucas, or Thomas, wasn't just leaving messages. He was communicating, asking questions, sharing glimpses of his life, and even trying to understand Ken's. He was curious, nervous, and sometimes even kind. In another message, Lucas wrote, "I see that in thy time thou dost have many things which I have not. Thou hast the box of lights, and thou art wiser than any man I know, for thou knowest things beyond my understanding." He truly believed Ken was from another world, and that his glowing box of lights might be witchcraft. But over time, Lucas began to open up, asking for trust and warning Ken that something larger might be at play. Little did Ken know, Lucas was exactly right. Because just when he thought he was beginning to understand what was happening, forming this strange, impossible connection with someone from the 1500s, the computer delivered something new. A new message. But this wasn't from Lucas. And it didn't sound human. It was cold and direct, and unsettling in a way that felt different from everything before. The message claimed to be from an intelligence called 2109, a presence not from the past, but from the future, specifically the year 2109. Here's what it said. We are 2109. You must not interfere. Communication must cease unless conditions are met. Your concept of time is incorrect. We are not here to cause fear, but the situation is delicate. Ken, Deb, and Peter must be patient. The experiment is not yet complete. The tone was clinical, authoritative. 2109 seemed to be monitoring the conversation between Ken and Lucas, treating the entire thing as part of some grand experiment. They warned Ken to proceed carefully, to follow rules they never fully explained. They even addressed all three people in the house, Ken, Debbie, and their friend Peter, by name. But how? 2109 spoke in strange riddles about time, perception, and consciousness. They implied that both Ken and Lucas were being observed and manipulated. At one point, 2109 even suggested that Lucas wasn't really from the 1500s at all, but instead a kind of constructed intelligence meant to communicate within the boundaries of the experiment. Now, after months of bizarre messages, it finally just stopped. And there was no grand finale and no closure, it just ended up being silence. The computer, Ken's old BBC Micro, went quiet. And Lucas, the man from the 1500s, vanished from the screen. 2109's strange warnings and riddles ended with one final sentence. We will never speak to you again. And they didn't. Eventually, Ken moved out of the cottage. The files didn't reappear, no other messages came. The experiment, if that's what it was, had apparently ended. But it left behind something else. A lingering feeling, a kind of metaphysical residue. Because even now, no one has truly explained what happened in Dodleston. A hoax, an elaborate act of mental projection, a ripple in time, or maybe something was trying to show us that time isn't linear or as separate as we think. Alright, so of course we're going to go ahead and jump into what I think and my own theories about this case. Now, I kind of skipped the part where I go on to the internet theories because honestly, I don't want to go too deep into whether I believe this case is a hoax or not. Because honestly, whether it's real or not, it's still a fascinating and thought-provoking supernatural story that deserves to be discussed. I will say this. Writing that many lines of accurate medieval English would be incredibly difficult. That alone gives me pause. But when I step back from the technical side of things and look at the actual story, what stands out to me most are the themes of miscommunication, perspective, control, and the deep human fear of the unknown. One thought that really sticks with me, if this was some kind of experiment, then 2109 was clearly the instigator. But 2109 didn't present themselves in a way that invites trust. They were cold, authoritative, vague, the kind of presence most people would not willingly open up to. And I think they knew that. Personally, I believe this may have been some kind of experiment, but not in the way we usually imagine. I think 2109 needed both Ken and Lucas, or Thomas, to become their most authentic selves, to break down the masks and personas people usually wear. Because whatever 2109 is, they couldn't do that themselves. Lucas and Ken both did speak to 2109, Lucas even admitted to thinking Ken was 2109 at one point, so we know there was a crossover. But what fascinates me most is how these two men, separated by centuries, were both terrified of each other for the exact same reasons: miscommunication, confusion, fear. And yet, they eventually let their guards down. They began to relate, to connect, to share details of their lives and experiences with someone who moments earlier felt like a threat. And you can't fake that kind of authenticity. Here's the thing I've learned through the supernatural. Whatever they are, many of them seem to hate the fake personas we show to the world. The version of ourselves we put on to protect our jobs, our families, our egos, our safety, that's not the version they're interested in. That's not who they remember us being, or who they want to understand. Whether 2109 came from another timeline, another dimension, or something stranger, I think they set the conditions in a way that allowed two people, Lucas and Ken, to connect as real people, stripped of pretense. And how did they do that? Through emotion. Fear, confusion, curiosity. That emotional vulnerability broke down the barriers and let something real shine through. And from an experimental standpoint, it's kind of genius. Whether supernatural or not, this case reminds me that authenticity can transcend even time itself. Alrighty, thank you for listening to another case of supernatural signals. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment, subscribe, and hit that like button. But yeah, other than that, thank you for watching. And as always, stay curious and stay tuned into the supernatural. Thanks.